All right, welcome to our first meetup of the year, everybody. It's great to see such an amazing turnout, and we're excited to cover this topic here today. And if you don't know, from all of us, we want to say Happy New Year. Stick a couple of sticky notes up there with my messy handwriting, and we're excited to be back and looking forward to many more of these. We've got some great things planned for the first half of the year here. But if anyone's interested in presenting or any topics they'd like to hear, reach out to one of us or through the Meetup channels, and we'd be happy to discuss that. We also want to say thanks. When we're in person, Tech Systems has always treated us great. They've also been great with helping people get job placement and also create awareness for people that are hiring. So if you are hiring or if you're looking for a gig, Tech Systems is someone to recommend. They also are awesome at sponsoring events and giving us beer and pizza when we are on site, which is amazing. Wanted to let everyone know about our mission, and let's see, I hope that thing's on. Our mission is to create opportunities for everyone to learn and share knowledge about the field of user experience. That doesn't mean that you have to be a UXer. That means you can be in PM, you can be a developer. You don't even have to be in the software space, really. There are obviously a lot of opportunities out there for UX, and also maybe sometime you might run into somebody that might be right for our field and you could recommend it. Our co-organizers are Abhishek, Leah, myself, Jason, and Matt. Please hit us up on LinkedIn. We're always happy to chat, maybe meet up afterwards and have a conversation or two about what we do. And also if there's a conversation you'd like to have not related to UX, that's okay. We do a lot of different things out there. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We noticed that a lot of people have their cameras on. We commented a second ago. Thank you for that. That's amazing. At the end, we'll try to take a screenshot. But we do love seeing you. It helps make a connection with the way everyone is remote now. But we love that we're able to see people from all over the nation. It's amazing. So thank you for coming. If you do have a question to ask, add a comment by saying question from Matt and then your question. We do have a couple Matts on here, but we'll know that that one's intended for Matt Hales. And we'll try to respond to those questions toward the end. But also comment in the comments if there's something that Matt says that you're like, oh yeah, I've seen that, or any thoughts that you have, that's welcome too. But if you have a specific question, just put it in that context so that we know that you'd like to maybe speak to that. And with that, the topic tonight is UX designer to product manager, an adventure of relationship management and influence. The moderators tonight will be myself and Jason Baird. And let me see, Matt is our presenter. He's a product manager for Home Depot. Connect with him too if you get a chance. Matt's a great guy. I had an opportunity to work with Matt at the Home Depot, and we had some wonderful conversations, great back and forth opportunities to help each other grow. And I really appreciate the relationship that I've had with Matt the time that I've known him. And as you can see here, Matt's a UXer turned PM. That's how he came to this topic. And he's working on a graduate degree in critical and creative thinking. He's a father of 2 tiny humans who always jump on the Zoom calls. So if they aren't in bed or happen to get up and they walk past in the background or jump in Matt's lap, don't be surprised, but it's welcome. And with that, we'll pass it on to Matt.
Awesome. Thank you, Wes. All right. I'm going to start my presentation on my side first and then attempt to share. This is always the fun part. All right. I'm going to assume that you're all seeing my actual slides and not my speaker notes, but sometimes that'll happen, and we'll figure it out as we go.
Looks great, Matt.
Awesome. All right. I don't know where my chat went though. I wanted to have the chat window open too, but it's all good. All right, I will rely on Wes to help me out with some of the chat stuff as well. So really just wanted to start out just saying a huge thanks to everyone for coming out and spending your time with us this evening. There's a lot of other things that you could be doing, but I'm really excited to have your time and attention. Those are a couple of things that are worth a lot. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation with all of you. Tonight, we're going to be talking about kind of my story of going from being a UX designer to a product manager. But more than just kind of talking about that narrative, I really want to apply a more generic lens to what it means to manage relationships and build influence in the workplace. And so before we dive in, I kind of want to start with something that I learned from some really smart UX designers at Home Depot when we used to do a lot of lunch and learns and things there. I'm hoping that this conversation and this topic has already spurred some questions in a few of your minds, and that maybe you've brought some questions already before we even get started. And I want to make 100% sure that those questions are not left unanswered by the end of this evening. So I'm going to ask you already right now to go ahead and drop any of your questions that you have into the chat. Go ahead and do it right now. I won't answer them immediately, but the idea will be that I will take any of those questions and answer them hopefully throughout the presentation at the times where it makes the most sense. And if for some reason I don't get to any of them by the time we're done, then they'll be the first ones we get to before our time runs out. And so I'm also going to have Wes copy each of those questions down and keep me honest as we go to make sure that I'm accountable and answering them as best I can. And I'm hoping I can get, let's see if I can get to my chat window somewhere. All right. Looks like I can see the videos, but I can't get to everyone's chat. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to make that work. There it is. All right. As soon as people started typing stuff, I got them. So this is perfect. Okay. And I may ask a few clarifying questions for some of these. We'll just take the next 30 seconds or so to drop any questions in that you might have come with. So let's see. If you're looking to switch from senior to to PM, how to avoid a drop in pay? That's a great question. All right. What do I miss most about UX? That's a good one. The opportunity to move. Come to you. We'll definitely get to that opportunity. So that one we'll cover for sure. Why do you want to leave UX and enter product? Yeah, we'll definitely cover that. And when seeking PM, how do you apply skills from UX towards PM? Okay, great. We'll cover some things close to that, and I'll make sure that I put that lens on it as well when we get there. Cool. All right, I'm going to copy each of these questions and paste them into my presentation so I don't forget to answer them. Oh, there's a couple more. Let's see. Advanced theater in U versus PM in U. Oh, the UXer. You're looking at features of functions. That's a good one. What are some cost-free certificates? Languages. Okay. All right. And they say everyone's our solution. How do you prevent? That's a good question, Alexis. All right. So some great questions. I'll go ahead and move on. But as Wes mentioned, feel free at any point during this conversation to drop any questions that you have into the chat. And if I don't see them right away, again, I'll be relying on Jason and Wes and others to make sure that I answer those, especially if we're on a topic that's similar and I just haven't remembered them because there are a number of good ones there. Also, I am totally fine if people want to jump off mute and just throw some questions into the fray while we're going as well. I really do enjoy more of the conversational perspective of this. So feel free to do some of that. But on the topic of questions, so there are a couple of questions that I have brought to kind of share with you all this evening. And these are two of the questions that have really been guiding my thinking around this topic in general. And so I'm hoping we can keep these in the back of our minds while we talk tonight. So these are the two questions. What kind of relationships do you want to have, and what kind of influence do you want to have? And so kind of keep these in the back of your mind as we go. We'll be revisiting them throughout. And specifically within the vein of the second question, I'd like to begin with a short activity, so an icebreaker, if you will. And the goal of this activity is actually going to have us reflect on our own sphere of influence as it stands today. And so to help with this, we're going to be engaging with a model that's called the circle of influence. I'm sure some of you have already seen something like this before. It's from Stephen Covey's best-selling book. And just as a note, you'll see in the bottom left of my slides, I'll be including references to any of the sources that I'm quoting. And before anyone asks, yes, I will share the slides after, so don't worry about jotting down all the things you see on them, although feel free to take notes on anything that is not on them. So this is a simplified version of Stephen Covey's model, and includes just these two areas, the circle of influence and the circle of concern. In the middle, you'll see I've kind of specified that it could be people or things that you have some influence over. And outside of that, you'll see the circle of concern being things that you may have little or no influence over. And so thinking about people and things is one way that may help you kind of brainstorm a few ideas around what might fit within each of these different spaces. And so for this activity, I'm going to have you each grab just a piece of paper and something to draw with. And we're going to take the next 3 or 4 minutes to just quickly sketch out a version of this for ourself in our current role. So take whatever role you're in right now, and even if that's not necessarily an employment role, if you're a student or something else, that's fine. Just take whatever that role is today, draw these 2 circles, and then start to fill in some things that might fit within each of those 2 circles. And after we're done, we'll briefly split into some breakout rooms and share what we've drawn with a couple other people and discuss some things from there. So 3 or 4 minutes to draw something like this for yourself in your current role. Ready, set, go.
And so I've always wanted influence over that, but I don't have influence over the roadmap.
I already love where this is going. Don't stop. Continue.
We were talking about the same thing in our group about how developer feasibility, there's a lot of factors that are outside of our control as product designers, and that the product owners and product managers are listening to all the sources, and we, user concerns and consistent experience is just one of the sources of inputs, that we're providing to product. So a lot of those things are outside of my influence as well.
Cool. Yeah, I'm actually really glad that part had already started, because I did want to take the next at least few minutes and just see if a couple of people would be willing to share some of the things that came up in their breakout room, either some insights or anything else that was learned, or just something that you thought was interesting. Feel free to either just unmute and jump in or drop something in the chat, whatever is less awkward.
I think I'll go first. I think one of the interesting things that came as a pattern is requirement, like business requirement context. A lot of times we are getting this sort of requirement to solve this problem, but the problem is usually just the pain of the real cost. We really don't understand the real cost, right? And it's because there's no context being defined. So we don't know why a customer might be experiencing something. So we end up assuming what the pain, the kind of like the source of the pain is, and designing and delivering a solution, but then it really doesn't solve the problem.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's definitely a huge part of this. And let's see, in the area of concern, it looks like we have timelines and marketing of a product. Okay. If you want to speak any more to that, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, just dropping it in the chat is good as well.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add a little bit more than a couple of words over there.
Awesome.
So talking about concerns, or first let's talk about the influence. Overall in our group, we had talked about that as a UX designers, we do have an influence over the design decisions which we make, the components we design for the product. And when it comes to the concerns, it was mostly the timelines, right? When to deliver a product and when not to deliver a product. It has happened that like people need it just at the end of the day. And it is also the case where they do need it at the end of the day, but it was never used, right? So that's one part. And the second is marketing, right? You design a particular product, and if it's a public facing product, it goes out there in the market. So it's all taken over by another team. So you have designed with as and copy plays a very important part in UX, right? So as those team, they talk, they I mean, their intentions or uh, maybe their area of expertise are mostly into maybe sales. I don't know if that's the right word to use here, but make how to make a product look good just with the copy. So that is one of the differences which we talked about in our group.
Cool. Yeah, thank you for sharing. I really like the concern of timelines, because I think I'm sure a lot of people can resonate with that one on this call, at least at some point, if not at the moment. All right, looks like Nadia and Matt have a couple of good ones in the chat. If either one you want to drop in.
Well, I've had a bit of an employment gap, but what I remember is that sometimes the people who are empowered to make the decisions aren't the ones who actually understand the client. And it's sometimes getting those internal stakeholders to realize that the way they think is not necessarily the way the end user thinks, and that this product should not be designed for the internal stakeholder, it should be designed for the end user. That can be a pain point.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. All right, and this will probably be the last one, but Matt, do you want to expand any more on your comment in the chat?
Sure. Yeah, I was talking and just kind of reflecting on the fact that I have a lot of autonomy in my role. But I think one of the big things that will always kind of be in that circle of concern always ends up just fitting into that category of design constraints, which aren't always a bad thing. Sometimes constraints really help to elevate design into territories that wouldn't otherwise get to. But you know, when you're dealing with like legacy code bases, APIs, integrations, I think I even throw in there just like hardline stakeholder decisions of like, it has to do X, Y, or Z, regardless of what the research shows. Sometimes things like that can really kind of hit a project in an interesting way. But yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. I actually really like just bringing in that idea of that some of the things in the circle of concern could have some sort of an impact on the decisions you're making within your circle of influence. I like that idea of bringing in constraints there. That's really cool. All right, well, awesome. I'm going to put a bit of a pin in this circle of influence diagram, and we're going to revisit it from my perspective a little bit later. But before we go on, I do just want to reemphasize that I like this dialogue sort of format. I really like having more of this interactive conversation and less of the monologue presentation, hold your questions till the end sort of thing. So please drop things into the chat at any point while we're going. I'll try to keep an eye on it. And if I miss things, go ahead and somebody call me out. But also, again, unmute and just jump in at any point. I may try to leave some dramatic pauses here and there, maybe to allow people to have a moment to jump in where it's a little less awkward. But also, if there's anyone who's had different experiences, I understand that this is going to be from my perspective, from a role within Home Depot, and that's one way to look at UX and one way to look at product management. But other people have had similar or different experiences, and so I hope we can bring some of those into the conversation as well. So even if it's not a question, but it's just a hey, here's my perspective on the same thing, feel free at any point to jump in. All right. So in order to at least attempt to build some sort of shred of credibility in this, but also kind of let you see where I'm coming from, I figured I'd give you a quick rundown of just kind of who I am and what led to my jump into product management. I know there are a couple of questions about this in the chat, so hopefully I can touch on each of those. But we're going to look at basically my baby professional career up to where I am today in a much more straight-laced, still in my pajama pants seat working from home. So in the beginning, the first step was graduating with a BFA in graphic design at Utah State University. And so yes, I actually sit among all of my MBA branded business peers and get to tell them that I have an art degree. And I'm still employed. So, hey, it's a win-win. But I was extremely fortunate back then, and I say back then slightly tongue in cheek because it's only about a decade ago, but I was really fortunate to be able to just break right into UX out of graduation. Back in those days, if you knew your Gestalt principles and you had a pulse, you could pretty safely break into UX. And I definitely had one of those things. And so it was a lot easier than it is today. And unfortunately, I just have a ton of empathy for people trying to break in now because it's a very, very different environment. My first job within UX was at a large government contractor where I worked on the most interesting projects that I can never tell anyone about. In fact, some of that work was so secret, I didn't even know what it was. And I wish that was a joke, but it's actually like one of the things I was working on, only one person on our entire project was allowed to be read into it. And so there was this layer of metaphor on top of the layers of designs on top. And it was so confusing, but also just so fascinating at the same time. And so that was a very interesting way to get into a design career. After that, my next UX gig was at a much smaller Internet of Things company. And I worked on the experience of controlling thousands of network-enabled smart lights from a mobile device. So also a pretty interesting space to be working in, especially from a technology perspective, but still from an experience perspective as well. And then after that, the next step was where I am now, which is at Home Depot, where we love to say that we sell hammers. And initially I joined the massive enterprise UX team. But after about a year, I made the jump into product management and have been in that role for the past 3 years. And so the obvious question, and I'm pretty sure it came up. Oh, and I see that. What year was this? So I'm assuming we're looking at the very beginning. When I broke into UX, it was 2012. So a little less than a decade ago. But if that was to one of the, you're calling to see, yes, exactly. But if that question was directed towards one of the other things, let me know. I purposefully didn't put dates on this because some of it's just a little strange, but this is more of just my abstract crawl, walk, run, if I might. All right, so the obvious next question, which I think came up here as well, is wait, but why? Why go into UX? Or sorry, why switch from UX into product? So again, everyone is going to have slightly different experiences, and so some of these things may resonate at varying levels with anyone on this call. But the first question, let's see. The first thing that I would like to kind of focus in on is that the truth be told, my entire initial UX career, up until the point that I switched into product, it had been a bit of a constant battle to get a voice in most of the conversations that mattered. To get into those conversations, you either needed a business degree or you needed to get a seat at the table that just at the time was very difficult, especially as an individual contributor within UX. And so it came down to the point where I realized I essentially had two options. I could get an MBA or I could get a different title. And one of those things is a lot more expensive than the other. So I decided to go ahead and make the jump into product. And so now here I am on year 4 of my crash course into business, but obviously with a design lens. The second reason, which is similar to the first, was that I realized I would often have more influence over the end user's experience as a product manager than as a UX designer. And not only that, as a product manager, I had now suddenly a lot more influence in how involved my own UX designer could be in the process. And so one of the reasons I decided to make that jump was to be able to actually have more of that influence and what should the end experience be like, but also how could I make it easier for my own UXer to be involved at some of those levels that it was harder for me to be in as I was a UX designer. And then the third and last reason that I'll touch on here is that I realized after doing UX for a while that my favorite part of all of the UX work that we did was everything that was people focused. It was the interviews, it was the collaborative design workshops, the relationships that I built. It was all of the things that were very people focused. And many of those things are a big part of a UX designer's job, but they're much more front and center as a product manager. And we're going to dive into that in a lot more detail over the next few slides. And so I'm not going to exhaust that one just quite yet. But getting back to the two questions that I asked initially, the way that I want to focus in on two of these three reasons is that more UX involvement, I mentioned already, that's influence. And focusing on people, for me, that's the relationship management. We're going to skip the first one just because it's pretty self-explanatory, but also it's just not that exciting to talk about gaining business acumen. So I'm actually going to start with the third one, which is the focus on people. And the lens that I like to apply to that are some of the sort of day-to-day activities that I engage in as a product manager, and the importance that relationship management plays within these things. And I want to touch on each of these, and you'll notice pretty quickly that there is an overlap with a lot of UX roles, which is great. But you also probably start to notice that I can really geek out on these topics because they have become so much more crucial to my day-to-day as a product manager than they ever were in UX. It was almost nice to be able to do some of these things as a UX designer, but it's really sink or swim as a product manager if you can excel within these areas. There are more. There are a few that I dropped off, including discovery and some other sort of more research-related work that has a lot of overlap with UX, but these are the ones that I want to focus on this evening, mostly in the interest of time. I had to cut a lot of slides out of this presentation because I knew that time flies. All right, so let's start with facilitating dialogue. So I really don't think I can overstate the amount of time that I spend planning for and participating in and facilitating conversations. And to illustrate the difference between a planned or a structured dialogue versus its opposite, I'd like to just kind of quickly step through some fields of conversation from a model from Otto Scharmer. And what we'll see right away in the first two fields of downloading and debate, that these are probably things that we know all too well. Field one of downloading is just simply dumping information from one brain into another. These are our classic status updates. These are what a lot of classes and presentations look like, hopefully not this one. And it's really just where we're saying, here's some information, I'm gonna take it out of my brain and put it in yours, and that's it. And the second one of debate, we're probably all familiar with as well, and it's typically just defending our opinion with unilateral conviction. It's one side or the other, and it's a fight to the death. And unfortunately, these two modes of conversation characterize the vast majority of our interactions. And there are times where these sort of things are okay. I would look at something like I assume a lot of people have a 15-minute stand-up in the morning with their teams, and that's something where downloading is fine. You know, give a quick recap of the previous day and then move on to the next thing. Where I think this maybe becomes less appropriate is if you're having 30-minute to an hour status update meetings, where it's really just sharing information that could have been an email. And debate is similar. There's times where it can work, especially when decisions need to be made quickly. But most of the time, we're trying to make important decisions that require some deliberation, or we're trying to tap into our collective creativity, or we're simply just trying to find ways to collaborate better. And in those instances, we need dialogue. So dialogue emerges when we engage with things like empathic listening, when we suspend our judgment, or when psychological safety becomes a norm in the way that we define our group. And I found that as a product manager, I have an outsized impact on whether or not these conditions actually arise in my team environment. And so having a strong relationship with each member of the team, as well as my stakeholders and anyone else within the extended team, is a prerequisite in order to enter this level of communication. You can have downloading or debate with anyone that you meet on the street, but it's a lot more difficult to step into the next level of dialogue. But what dialogue gets you is a high-performing team. People feel that they're free to share their ideas, even their half-baked ones, because the environment is safe to do so. And you get higher levels of creativity and more innovation. And you also just get higher levels of engagement and work satisfaction. And so at the end of the day, it's simply just how we converse as a team. But there are good ways to do it, and there are the ways that we usually do it. And you'll notice that there is one more field, which is field 4. And we won't get into that. I'm going to leave that for you to explore if you're interested, but that's going even a step further and takes a lot of work, but is super useful. All right.
You just taunted a bunch of UX people, you know that.
That may have been deliberate.
Okay, as long as we're on the same page there.
Yes, no, there's more content than can be covered here, so I'm hoping to dangle a little bit out there, but I'm always happy to discuss some of these things further, and so I'm hoping that some people may reach out afterwards if we're looking to cover some of these topics in a little more detail. So that would be one I would highly encourage. Again, down in the left there, you'll see Otto Scharmer and his book, as well as he's done lots of talks and other things on Theory U, is where most of this comes from. All right, so next on that list of 4 things is vision, strategy, and planning. And so effective dialogue, we're gonna kind of build on each other in a few layers here, but effective dialogue and strong relationships, they set the stage for discussing personal and shared visions. But unfortunately and predictably, ineffective dialogue and weak relationships hinder that process. So Peter Senge, he's a lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He puts it this way, that most visions are one person's vision and they're imposed on the organization. And that these definitely do not get the level of commitment that we would look for. They at best command compliance. But a shared vision is one that everyone is truly committed to, and it's because it reflects their own personal vision. And so the better we can get at understanding people's personal visions, especially the ones that we work with, like, again, our product team, our stakeholders, the easier it becomes to uncover what our collective shared vision truly is. And so as that shared vision becomes clear, we can collaboratively identify the strategies that would support it, as well as plan on how we might move in the right direction. But getting that initial vision right is really the most important step. And again, it's based on things like having good dialogue with the people that we work with and building strong relationships so that they're willing to share what their personal vision is with you. All right, so the third of these 4 is fostering collaboration. This is already a bit of a running undercurrent in the previous points, but it helps to call this one out specifically because dialogue, as well as creating shared visions and strategies, these things can't be done in isolation. They have to be done collaboratively. And so while there are a lot of angles that we could use to approach collaboration, I just want to call out 3 on here, primarily from the work of Dr. Garrison down in the corner. The first one, which we've kind of already touched on a bit, is thinking collaboratively. And so this is the idea that there are ideas in groups that could not be pulled out individually. They only come to light when we have a group that feels psychologically safe and that is committed to a shared vision. And that's how we can start to get to this high-performing team that is more than the sum of its parts. There's also collaborative constructivism, which is just a fancy term for how we find meaning in the work that we're doing. And ideally, in this instance, finding that meaning together. So whether it's exploring our personal or shared visions, or even just putting a lens on some of the more daily, smaller decisions that we make along the way, a group or an organization or a team is more likely to be successful when we're finding meaning in similar ways. And then the last one, at least on collaboration, is how it fits in with competition. And I really just wanted to at least briefly mention this because a lot of people are huge fans of bringing competition into just about any environment. And we just have to be intentional. A lot of times competition will actually destroy group trust and drive bad behavior, whereas collaboration and increased collaboration will improve most scenarios and help bring teams together. All right. And then the last of these 4 relationship building things I just want to touch on is building and maintaining alignment. And I think if there was one thing that PMs are most responsible for, it would be this. The strong relationships that are built through dialogue and collaboration pave the way to being aligned to a shared vision. And to put a definition on what alignment really means, I'm going to use one more quote from Peter Senge, but he says that alignment means functioning as a whole. That building alignment, and it's important to note here that you never get there. This is an ongoing process. It's about enhancing a team's capacity to think and act in new synergistic ways with full coordination and a sense of unity because team members know each other's hearts and minds. And so the way I kind of look at this is that if all of the other elements are in play, if dialogue is the default mode of conversation, if our shared vision is something that everyone is committed to, and if the team is consistently leaning into radical collaboration, that this is the end result. It's, again, that idea that the whole can be greater than the sum of its parts, and that when we're functioning as a whole, it's because we really tapped into each other's hearts and minds. All right, so I'm going to pause for just a moment, just in case there are any thoughts or any questions around those 4 aspects of dialogue, vision, strategy and planning, collaboration, and building alignment. All right, how do you build these qualities in new teams versus seasoned teams? This is a really good question because, again, it's not something that one person can be well versed in and do it for the whole team, but it has to be something that everyone plays a role in. One of the ways that I've approached this at Home Depot is having lunch and learns and other sort of workshops that I'll put together around some of these topics in and of themselves. So I've done a handful of just small sort of 1 hour or even 30-minute dialogue sessions where we'll talk about what dialogue is, what dialogue isn't, how we get there, how teams can use it effectively, things like that. As well as obviously just modeling the right behavior, although that can only get so far because some of these things, it really helps to be versed in the, let's say, the theory of it, and then be able to apply that to real situations. One of the other approaches that I've taken recently is taking some of my product management peers through some of these different workshops. So not just my product team or stakeholders, but also some of my product management peers so that they can start to practice some of these things with their own teams. So kind of trying to do a bit of a grassroots movement at the product level. And how's the team responded? It's been really interesting. It's kind of a lot of times put under this broader lens of like interpersonal skills, which everyone tends to agree are really important, but also I don't know how to say that those things are helpful. And so they tend to get a lot of support initially, but then it's something that you really have to practice and you have to put into the way that you actually work with your teams. And that takes, I think, a lot of times more work than people are willing to put into it. And so it's one of the reasons I've had just kind of a series of workshops as opposed to just a one-time effort. Because even just building something like self-awareness or building the capacity to suspend judgment in your conversation is not something that one workshop is going to cover to the degree that you're going to be a professional. And so it's introducing the concept, it's giving people some hands-on experience practicing the concepts, and then it's revisiting those concepts again in the future. All right, and then what if talking about unity and alignment just isn't landing? Are there good resources for it? Yes. Yeah, so for activity-based workshops, let's see, I'm trying to remember the name of it. Liberating Structures is a good website that has a lot of really interesting activities that fall into some of these categories. That's one that I haven't referenced in here, but I would definitely point people to. And I guess when approaching something like unity and alignment, and if it's not landing, again, the difficulty with some of these things is just showing concretely how it adds value in kind of a short period of time. Like it's something in my current team. I joined the product team that I'm on right now 2 years ago. So it was actually the second team that I came onto as a product manager. And initially our relationship with our stakeholders was not great. And not just as my product team, but really just most of the product managers in the space, most of IT with those business partners. It was kind of constantly butting heads. And so something that I had to spend about the first year on that team of doing was really just building relationships with our business partners. And it was building them in authentic and just transparent ways of saying, there's a lot of history here, there's a lot of baggage. Let's just talk about what our goals are. Let's talk about what we're trying to do. Let's try to align behind a common purpose, and let's just collaborate on everything. Again, almost this radical collaboration sort of approach. And it took more than a year within the space to get to the point that I could say we could actually sit down and have meaningful conversations with each other without being too worried about what the other side was saying or thinking after or during the meeting on the side. But a lot of this, I think, is just something that has to be done through example, modeling that right behavior, but also helping other people understand that it is something that you're doing intentionally, and it's not just, you have a good personality or something. Because some people can get away with that for a while, but it's harder to bring people in if they don't know how you're actually approaching some of these things. And I would also highly recommend each of the different references that I'm including here as well as more ways to jump into it. Anything specific for building alignment? I think that's where things go all over the place. I totally agree. Again, I think some of these other things have to be in play before it's really almost possible to start building alignment. It's really hard to take people who don't work well together and who don't trust each other and be aligned on anything. And so there's some groundwork that kind of has to be done before you can get there. I found myself in teams with high level alignment dialogue, but also some who didn't. Do you think?
I can throw it.
Yeah.
If you don't want to just read it.
Sure.
Yeah, I was I've come across some instances where you get that groove with a team of people and you're really finding that alignment, really able to have that dialogue with each other. But then I've definitely worked with some folks who just weren't interested in that, right? And very focused on like, get in. Unfortunately, I don't mean to perpetuate any developer stereotype, but yeah, like a dev who's just like, I just want to write code, don't talk to me, right? Like, tell me what to do, and then I'm going to go write code, and you'll see it when it's done, kind of thing. And I was just wondering if, in your experience, if you've been able to kind of break past that, if this can work for folks who are resistant to it, or if it's like you kind of need to have people that are open-minded to this kind of way of engaging for it to even be a feasible approach?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the things I'm not really touching on as much here, but it's the idea that there, obviously are a lot of different personality types. And by a lot, I mean, really everyone is unique. I'm not referring to, Myers-Briggs or something, but there's really an infinite number of personalities that you're going to interact with. And so I think a huge piece of this when it's building relationships with others is that you try to break out of the idea of I'm building relationships with my developers and more of I'm building a relationship with Todd, and I'm building a relationship with Michael, and I'm building a relationship with each of them as an individual person. And while that's happening, you're trying to gauge what level of involvement they want with some of these things. Because again, to your point, it doesn't even have to be a developer. A lot of people just don't necessarily want to be involved in a lot of the conversations. Like they just want to know what to do, keep their head down, and they find meaning in the work that they're doing when they're not collaborating with other people. And that's fine. It's understanding where people want to be involved, how they want to be involved, and where they are most engaged in their work. Because if you can pinpoint that and you can engage people at the right level, then you'll be able to get the most out of what they're willing to contribute to the team. If you try to pull that super introverted and just interested in writing really amazing code developer into every single design workshop, like it's not helping your team. It's going to help your team to maybe have a 5-minute conversation with him after stand up and then let him or her go ahead and just go and bang out code while you work on other things. But knowing that they've been able to have a voice and that that person has been able to share something, even if it's just to a smaller degree.
If I can add a little bit to that, when you talk about emotional intelligence, that's something my boss and I do, is that some people come alive in different settings. Like some people, if we are in a group setting type situation and you ask a certain question, they feel attacked. So you want to almost like sense that. And I have one coworker where we had, that was quite a challenge. And then I realized that when he was presenting something, he would come alive and he didn't have any problem. I was like, that's how I need to communicate with him, is ask him to present something based on a question. And that solved the whole communication issue. Sometimes it's just feeling out how they're behaving in certain different settings throughout the day, and you will pick it up how they like to communicate.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. And again, doing that at the individual level, because a lot of times I'll hear, again, like developers all referred to as, introverted or something like that, or even just business people that are all type A or something. But again, you're going to find different levels of that with every single person you work with. And so treating people as individuals and finding out where, I like how you said how they come alive, like what are those environments where they come alive? That's perfect. I love that. All right, I think I got the questions in the chat. And again, we'll continue to move on, but please jump in at any point. And if I missed any, again, let me know. And also, Wes, if there's any questions that I've missed along the way that would fit in some of these areas, yeah, just drop in. Okay. So now that we've gone into probably excruciating detail on that people focus, we'll take a step back and start looking at the more UX involvement. And so this is where we're going to revisit, as I mentioned before, it took a little bit, but we got back to it, the circle of influence. And we're going to quite literally zoom in and look at this in a little bit more detail. So if I were to have taken a few minutes to fill this out from the perspective of my past UX roles, here are a few things that I probably would have mentioned. So there's obviously the end user experience. I know a couple other people already talked about this, but the end user sentiment. I like to call those things out separately, because sometimes the experience and the sentiment, especially in products that maybe generally aren't that interesting, if you're building the newest, greatest time clock for somebody, the sentiment may be that it's awesome, even if the experience is just kind of okay, because all the ones in the past have been terrible. And so they're interesting things to kind of pull out and to tease apart. But then also one that I would definitely put on here is the level of creativity within the team. And I think that a UX designer actually has a really interesting role to play, where they can either a lot of times be the sole holder of the keys of creativity on the team, or on the other end of the spectrum, they can be the one that really invites the entire team to unleash their creative potential. And so I think these are at least a couple of things immediately within the circle. And then, as I mentioned before, some of the people, so probably not a lot of surprises here, but the product team, and this could be PMs, engineering. A lot of our other product teams maybe include marketing or sales or other people as well. And then immediate stakeholders, and of course, end users. This isn't meant to be exhaustive, but if I were to take 2 or 3 minutes, these are a few of the things that would get the conversation started. And then in the circle of concern, these are maybe a few things that I would put in there. Some of them we've touched on already, as well as some of them are people groups that in the past I didn't necessarily get a ton of face time with. But I'm sure you're probably already multiple steps ahead of me and seeing where this is going. So if we were to then say, all right, what does this same circle of influence look like now as a product manager? Again, shouldn't be any surprise, but I would extend the circle of influence to include all of those things. And this is by necessity. This isn't necessarily because I'm choosing to have influence over those areas, but it's critical to the way that I perform my job. And some higher level things may begin to appear on the periphery. And I want to be clear when kind of looking at these two different views that neither one of these circles of influence is inherently better than the other. They're simply different. And increased influence cuts both ways. I spend so much more of my time now as a product manager cultivating positive relationships and extending my circle of influence than I ever did as a UX designer before. And that requires a lot of maintenance and, to be totally truthful, a lot more stress. I find myself working more hours and touching base with people a lot more often than I ever did as a designer. And getting back to talking about how I could get more involvement in UX, this has been a really interesting experience for me because I can now start to bring my UX designer to a lot of these conversations that I was never able to participate in the past. Knowing that my UX designer also has to, design things here and there, we have to align on where it makes sense to have her in the room in some of these bigger, more strategic conversations, or when she knows that I can handle things on my own. But I typically lean into saying, you should be at least in the room in these conversations and sometimes taking the lead. And that's where I think we can really start to see the value that UX brings to the table. And I think as a product manager, that's allowed me to get into these conversations. But the more the product managers see the value of the UX, the more that as designers, we'll start to hopefully see our circle of influence expanding beyond what I have had it be in the past. And so this really just leads back to my two initial questions of what kind of relationships and influence do we want to have? And I think these are two of the most important questions we can ask ourselves, regardless of whether we're looking at UX or product management or really any other role that we might take in the future. Reflecting on these can really help us make sure that we're moving towards the right professional fit. I think each of us are going to identify things about the way that we work that we like. And it's about finding the role that checks the most boxes for the things that you find most engaging and most meaningful. And so for me, 3 years ago, that meant moving to product management. But I know there's at least a few people on the call who are probably on the fence between product and UX, whether this is the first role or whether you've been in UX for a while and are considering making that jump. And so the last slide I wanted to put together was just making sure I adequately answer this question of, is product management right for me? Here are just a couple of questions that you could ask yourself to see whether or not that PM hat is really the one you might want to put on in the near future. So 4 quick questions. One, and somebody has already touched on this, which I love. Are you more interested in the problem than the solution? So I think it may have been David who asked how you balance this, especially as a product manager moving from UX. Definitely as a product manager, I have to spend most of my time in the problem space and a whole lot less on the solution, and even less on being hands-on and actually creating the solution. So obviously my interaction in visual design and mockup building time, all of that clearly has gone out the window. And honestly, it's probably for the better. I was never a great visual designer. But as a product manager, you'll definitely be having to defer those solution making and solution building decisions to other members of the team. And so I have to find it comfortable to say, this is the problem the best I understand it. Now let's bring in UX engineering stakeholders, anyone else who knows things that I don't, which is a lot of people. And let's talk about what that solution might be. And then let's make sure that the team is ready to build that thing together. And so it's collaborating, it's relying a lot less on my own opinions, and it's sharing what I have, but not necessarily assuming that that's going to be the right thing. And a lot of times what my relationship with my own UX designer has created is the environment where she can do a lot of design work and then come to me and say, hey, here are some questions I have or some feedback I'm looking for or something like that. And then I can jump in and put on my design hat for a little bit but knowing that she's actually asking for it and I'm not just dropping in and saying, hey, have you thought about material or something? I noticed I skipped a question in the chat. So let's see, what's a good way to get PM to start seeing UX adds value being there earlier versus being handoff? Oh man, I could do probably a whole presentation on that without getting too deep into it. I think it gets back again to just building an initially strong relationship with product. I think PMs, just like a lot of people, are typically not going to understand what UX brings to the table. And it's not going to be self-evident just because you do good design work. And so it's about having those conversations. It's about understanding what is it your PM is trying to accomplish, like what are their personal goals, as well as the goals that they're working on in the space, and how can you help them reach those goals? And if you can start to show that product manager or anyone else you're working with, could be an engineering manager, it could be your stakeholders, how much you can help them reach their goals beyond just creating mockups and doing the things that everyone expects from UX. I think that's how you can start to work your way into being in more and more of the conversations earlier, because they'll see, hey, if I brought you in earlier, you could have solved this problem for me a lot faster. And I know that's oversimplifying it extremely, but that's the way I would start. Let's see. Know how other product teams was initially in the outer circle and then move. Okay, that's a good question. And actually, let me go ahead and jump back to that slide real quick because we're about done. All right. And again, this is from my experience, but as a UXer, I typically was working with my product team and not necessarily interacting a lot with other product teams. But as a PM, I have a lot of work that has dependencies on other teams, as well as a lot of the work that I do that has downstream effects on other product teams. And so I have a lot more conversations with product managers from other teams, but also occasionally business stakeholders, IT managers, and other people, making sure that we're not doing things that break things for other teams or just have unintended consequences, but also when we're lining up work between multiple teams, that we're sequencing things in the right order and making sure that we're prioritizing things effectively. And yeah, I didn't do a lot of that when I was a UX designer. The problem of underrated UX is the first push for me to start a product. Definitely. Do you find yourself connecting UX research and customer service to prioritize business goals and even budget? Absolutely. So yeah, again, one of those daily activities that I didn't dig into, at least in this presentation, was around discovery. And I look at user research as a huge part of discovery, but not all of it. A lot of product managers will spend time doing competitive research, doing research into technology trends and other things like that that can augment user research and saying this is the direction that our domain might be going. So for me right now, it's retail. It's doing a lot of research here and there, not just on what is the experience like for my users, but what are other business models the big retailers are looking at? What is technology that other retailers are experimenting with, and so on. And so I definitely find a huge amount of overlap there. And again, I defer to my UX designer to do a lot of, to plan a lot of the UX research. And then I continue to participate in any of the interviews or any of the synthesis or anything where she wants me to be involved. And budget, that's a whole other thing because Home Depot is big and there's a lot of big budget stuff that happens. All right, I'm gonna quickly touch on these because I know there are some people that need to jump off before 9. But the second thing I'll just touch on real quick is whether or not you prefer the manager schedule. So anyone who's familiar with the makers versus manager schedule, if you were to think about looking at your calendar today and every 30 minutes up until lunch, you had a different meeting, but after lunch, you had an entirely open afternoon, which one of those things gives you more anxiety? The manager's schedule is scheduling pretty much everything in 15 to 30 minute increments through your entire day. Whereas the maker schedule is about having multiple hour heads down time where you can actually do things. So if one of those things calls to you more, a product manager schedule is going to be much more on the manager's timeline, whereas a UXer is going to lean more towards a maker schedule and having at least periods of time where you're just able to focus on designing things. All right, and then how deep is your interest in technology and business? So some level of interest is definitely necessary for both roles. You can't get away from these in UX. But as a PM, you will definitely need to be able to speak to the business model and the technology nuances when your business and IT partners are not in the room. And so this is going to mean that you're going to spend a lot more time digging into how things work, why things are set up the way they are, and what sort of business goals you're trying to marry to your user needs. And then the last one, and this is really my favorite, and I'm loving that I can probably end on this one, is are you ready to seize culpability and defer recognition? So my favorite PMs that I work with will step up and say, that's on me when things are not going well. But when things are going well, they will step back and let other people be in the spotlight. Their designer, their engineers, their business partners. You basically have to be willing to lead without being a leader, because no one reports to you. It's all about influence, and it's all about the relationships that you build. And some people may find this terrifying. I find it great because I hate being in the spotlight most of the time anyway. But if something's going wrong, I have to be ready to step up and make sure it gets taken care of. All right, I know there are a handful of questions left, and so I want to make sure that we get to those now. I do see one in the chat about how much time to spend writing in tools like Jira. As little as possible. I find it most helpful to put just enough information in there to make sure things can move to the next step. But I consistently tell my engineers to spend as little time as necessary in there so that they can spend more time writing code. And I do the same thing as a product manager. I'd rather spend time catching up with people and building relationships than writing extremely detailed user stories. It's a really good book. Okay, extreme ownership, awesome. Wes or anyone else, what questions did I not touch on that were asked at the beginning?
Matt, I think you were catching them as we went through, but if we did miss someone, or if someone wants to chime in now, that's totally welcome and available.
Yeah, I'm gonna scroll up real quick. I may rapid fire a few of these, but hopefully we can at least touch on each of them.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
Moving from a senior UX position where you've done, I call it full stack UX, are there any barriers to entry that you see for product management, including salary?
Yes, so I was actually just scrolling up and I saw your question on avoiding a drop of pay, which is great. So I had the extreme good luck to make the transition from UX to product internally at Home Depot. And so I was able to negotiate a lot of things in my favor. If you were moving from UX at one job, at one company to product in a new company, this is probably going to be a lot more difficult. But I think one of the things that you can do is you can bring a lot of those research and people-centered aspects of UX over to the side of product management and tell a story about how you're ready to work with other people, how you're ready to collaborate, and how you're prepared to build things that are going to solve human needs. The biggest gap that I found, which is one of the things I called out on the reasons I switched, was just building the business acumen. I didn't take any business classes in school. With my art degree, it wasn't necessary, and I was cool with that at the time. But there was a lot to learn in that respect. And so, working with data and being able to do some of the things that were understanding how you connect, again, those business needs to the user needs was something that I had to do a lot of learning around. All right. Matt asked what I miss most about the UX role. Honestly, the other people. Working with a ton of UXers was just a lot of fun. If anyone's worked on a big UX team before, it's a ball of fun.
Hey, Matt, can you speak
Yes.
some more in what you mentioned about connecting the business requirements to user needs?
Yeah, this was probably one of the things I struggled with most as a UX designer in my early career. I was able to get to the point where understanding through user research, what the pain points were, what the opportunities were from a user's perspective, relatively well. But unfortunately, just solving for user pain points is rarely going to score you a ton of points with your business partners. It's being able to understand what are the pain points, what is the business trying to achieve, and where is the overlap between those two things, And that's where you can start to identify the things that will be a win-win for both your users, your business stakeholders, and for anyone else involved. And a lot of times you're going to run into scenarios where you have something that solves a user need, but maybe doesn't actually take you a step in the right direction in terms of the long-term strategy of the business or something like that. And so you'll need to be prepared to talk to those things when you say, hey, this is a problem, but I also understand that maybe it doesn't serve the longer term vision. And so how do we start to negotiate around what are the right things to do for the user versus the right things the business needs